I hope you're ready to channel your inner crafty elf, because in this video, we're gonna turn a quilted panel into some beautiful quilted projects. They're gonna add a little festive look to our decor. Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome back to the Season's Greetings video series. In the last video, we machine quilted the Season's Greetings panel I designed for the video series. And in this video, we'll explore how you can leave that panel as is for a beautiful wall hanging to add a festive look to your decor, or how you can cut it up into pieces and make some really cool quilted projects, including a wall hanging that also displays your favorite ornaments, a zippered pouch, and placemats. These projects are fun and easy to make, and they're perfect for last-minute gifts. If you haven't already purchased the Season's Greeting panels or the coordinating supplies, it's not too late to do so. Just click the link in the description box below to find out all the details about that. So now, all I have to do is find my rotary cutter and my ruler, and we'll get to cutting. In my last video, we quilted the Season's Greeting panel together. Now, I could leave this panel just as it is, put some binding on it, and call it a beautiful wall hanging. But I'm feeling a little bit more crafty than that. So we're gonna cut it up and create some different things out of the panel. First, I'm gonna trim off the excess backing and batting that's around it. To do this, I'm finding the biggest cutting mat and the biggest ruler I have. Here comes the scary part, cutting it into pieces, because you can't undo a cut. There's a couple different options you have for your panel, and the first one I'm going to show you is turning this bottom part into its own little wall hanging and turn the top part into some zippered pouches. So to do that, I'm going to cut it right here to make my smaller little wall hanging. And I'm actually going to cut it a couple of inches over the M. All right, I think I'm ready. This is the part I do before I start drinking the piecing potion. And there I have my first little wall hanging, so cute. I'm actually gonna gently set this aside for right now. And by gently, I mean toss it on the floor. And I'm gonna grab my other piece of fabric right here. So to make my zippered pouches, I'm gonna cut this into some rectangles. The zippers that I have to work with are 14 inches long. So my squares need to be 14 inches, with one side being 14 and a half. I know that sounds weird, but that's the seam allowance for the zipper. If you're working with like a 15-inch zipper, you would do a 15 by 15 and a half. So it really depends on the size zipper that you have. And while I don't have to be super worried about where I'm cutting, I do want to get most of this motif in the pouches as opposed to over here. So what I'm going to do is cut this right down the center and then measure out my sections from here. Now, if you're like, I don't even know what you're talking about, don't worry about it. Just cut out your pieces so you can make your zipper pouches. So I've got my quilted pieces cut out, I've got my two zippers, and all I need to do is grab my sewing machine so we can start assembling these. If I had to pick just one quilted gift that would be good for everybody in my life, I think it would be the zippered pouch. I mean, seriously, who doesn't love zippered pouches? You can never have enough, they hold all your favorite things, and basically just a lot of fun to make. So starting with your quilted square, if you would like, you could zigzag around the edges to give it a slightly more finished look. Then I'm gonna grab my zipper. So I chose this red zipper because I think it'd be beautiful with the fabric. And if yours has a closed end like this, just take a moment and snip that off because we're gonna need to separate those two here in just a little bit. Then I'll determine which side of my pouch I want to be the outside. Of course, I'm gonna go with this beautiful part for the outside, but if you wanted, you could make the beautiful red backing the outside of the pouch as well. But whatever side you're gonna go with, go ahead and lay it that side up. And then you're gonna place your zipper right side down along one of the edges. Then I'm gonna use some clips to kind of hold it in place. Then I'm just gonna sew it together. Now, if you had a narrow zipper foot, that would be the one to pull out and use right now. But since I can't find mine, I'm just gonna go with the foot I have on there. The thought of sewing on zippers used to always scare me. I mean, clear up until just a few years ago. But once you do one, you realize they're actually really easy to work with. At some point, I'm gonna stop and move the head of the zipper out of the way so I can finish the rest of the seam. So from this point, I'm just gonna fold the other side of my quilted sandwich and match it with the edge of the zipper like so. I'm making sure that all the edges are lined up and it's nice and even, and then I'm gonna clip it in place just like I did before. Again, stopping and moving that zipper head out of the way and then continuing on. And when you're done, you've got the first part of your zippered pouch. It doesn't look like a lot right now, but pretty soon it's gonna start coming together. So I'm gonna start by turning it right side out, like that. And then I'm gonna unzip it and separate those zippers. Because next I'm gonna do a little bit of top stitching by just folding this over in place and stitching another line right here. While it does add a couple more steps to making your zippered pouch, it does ensure that the zipper lays nice and flat and gives it that beautiful polished look. So I guess it's worth the effort. And I'm just holding that zipper over in place and stitching nice and close to that previous seam. I decided to use the red thread because it would blend in with that zipper, but if you want to add a little pizzazz to it, you can go with a contrasting thread color just to give it a little bit of a different look. Then of course I'm gonna do the same on the other side. Now here is my zippered pouch, not quite assembled yet. And now it's time to get the zipper pull back on the zipper so we can close it up. I'm just feeding both ends of the zipper into the pull, then I'll hold down the ends and kind of pull it up along the edge. That gets a lot easier the more you do it. I'm gonna turn my zipper pouch inside out. And then we're gonna close up the ends so we can start to see our pouch come together. First, I'm gonna position that zipper so that it's centered on my pouch. I don't really want it off center too much. I want it to be nice and centered. And then to keep it shifting, I'm just gonna clip it in place. And then I'm gonna take it to my sewing machine and sew a seam on both sides. I'm gonna sew it together with a 1/2 inch seam. That way it gives it a little bit more strength at the end. One of the scariest parts is you're gonna sew right over that zipper, but just take it slow and it will be fine. Until it's not. Oh man. Sometimes I think you're a true professional when you have broken a few needles. Whew, let's see if we can do this again without breaking the needle. Ooh. Now I'm like super nervous. I'm like, oh, okay, let's don't do it. Oh, yes, okay. Whew. That was a little stressful. And then again, since we're not putting a liner in our zipper pouch, if you want to give it that more finished look on the inside, you can zigzag along this edge right here. And then I'm gonna do the same on the other side. Fingers crossed, no broken needles. Now we finally have something that's starting to look a little bit like our zipper pouch. Unzip it a little bit so I can turn it right side out and show you what it's looking like so far. If I wanted to leave it just like this, I'd have a nice flat zipper pouch. It's actually great for cords or for spaces where you don't want something so bulky. But we can add some boxed corners to it to give it a more rounded, taller profile. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. So I'm gonna turn this inside out again. I just need a ruler and some kind of marking pen. So then I'm gonna go to my pouch and position the ruler so I have a little square cut out of the corner here. The size that you make the square will determine how tall or how boxy your pouch is. I'm gonna do 1.5 inches just because I think that sounds like fun, but you can experiment with other sizes as well. I'm just gonna take my marking tool and just mark that. There's actually a couple different ways that you can do this, but this happens to be my favorite. And then I'm gonna use my scissors to cut out that square. I'm just cutting through all the fabric. Then this is where the holiday magic happens. I'm gonna grab that corner, I'm gonna pull out the sides and pull them until they make a straight line. Then I'm gonna clip it in place and sew it together just like I did the edges of the zipper pouch. Again, with that 1/2 inch seam, and if you wanted to, you can add that zigzag stitch on the edge to give it that finished look. And to give it as much support as I can, I'm gonna back stitch at the beginning and the end of the seam. You sure would hate for this hole to bust open and let everything that's inside the pouch come out. That would not be good. And there's my first boxed corner, and I'm gonna do the same on all 3 corners. I love quilting and I love piecing, but I am definitely not a bag maker. I don't know, there's just something about projects with like all the lining pieces and all the other parts that just seems a little overwhelming. But this I can do. And then all I have to do is turn it right side out and enjoy my masterpiece. Make sure all those corners are poked out, nice and pointy. And of course, you could be pretty particular about how you lay out your fabric. For instance, if you wanted a design on the fabric to show up on a certain place of your pouch. But for these, I really love the abstract kind of look of it. You can see little traces of the Season's Greetings panel, but the fact that it's quilted and kind of abstract in the way it was cut out looks awesome. Then all that's left to do is to open it up and fill it with your favorite goodies. So I'm gonna start by cutting off that bottom section where it says Merry Christmas to make my smaller little wall hanging. Then I'm gonna set that aside for now and grab the remaining fabric. This I'm gonna cut into 4 rectangles to be our placemats. And I'm not even gonna worry about where I cut because I kind of like the abstract look of the placemats once they're finished. Then once that's done, all I have to do is bind them and then they're ready to gift or to decorate. Making wall hanging quilts is just so much fun, especially when you have every other surface of the house covered in quilts. And that's exactly what we're gonna do with this section of the panel. It's the perfect size for a small wall hanging that will brighten up any area of your house. But instead of making this just some plain old wall hanging, I'm gonna show you how to turn this into an ornament display for all of your favorite ornaments. But here's the thing, I probably can't just hang up this wall hanging as it is. I'm gonna need to add a little bit of binding around the outside. Binding just adds a finishing touch to your quilt and finishes up that raw edge. But if you know me, you know that I don't love binding. I mean, honestly, why can't the raw edge quilt just be a thing? And even though I don't love binding, I do love the I made this look even more. So I'm going to force myself to sit at the sewing machine and put binding around this. I can do adult things, hard things, even if I don't really want to. Thankfully, I have a couple new notions that are gonna make the binding a lot more fun. The binding ease is gonna make ironing the binding a snap. And this cute little tool is gonna help me keep the binding nice and organized so it sews on my quilt even easier. But before we can sew the binding onto the quilt, we have to make it first. It's kind of like making the Christmas cookie so you can then add the decorations. I'm gonna start by cutting my binding fabric into strips. I'm cutting mine about 2¼ inches wide, but you could go up to 2½ inches if you prefer. But I need to turn all these little strips into one long strip. So I'm gonna need to grab my sewing machine. To sew these strips together, I'm gonna take one strip and place it right side up, take the second strip and place it right side down at a right angle like this. Then I'm gonna sew a line from this corner to the opposite corner and trim off the excess. The reason I'm doing this is because it makes the seam just a little less bulky. And then when I open it up, we'll see that nice diagonal seam right there. Once I've made sure that seam is where I want it to be, I'm gonna trim off that excess fabric right here and repeat. It's kind of like a quilting binding conga line. I've gotta say, I am so proud of myself for adulting right now. Okay, maybe this isn't so bad. I've got my snacks, I've got my drink, I'm just sitting here sewing. I guess sometimes I can be just a little dramatic. Once I have one really long strip of binding, it's time to iron it in half. And to make that a little bit easier, I'm gonna use the binding ease to do that. Let me show you just how cool it is. Simply fold the binding in half and place it through the slots. Place the iron on top and pull it out the other side. As that binding passes underneath the iron, it's giving it that nice crease and it keeps my fingers out of the way, which I just love. And just like that, I have beautifully pressed binding. Then once it's all ironed, to keep all the binding together and ready to use, I'm gonna use another fun notion, the binding tool. While binding isn't my favorite part, using something sparkly like this makes it a lot more fun. I mean, how cute is it? It's gonna be all ready for me to use. Well, now that I have my somewhat perfectly made binding, it's time to sew it onto the quilt. Now, I know that there are quilters out there that are very particular and perfectionistic about their binding. They measure every corner, pin it in place just perfectly, and probably iron the binding standing on one foot. Spoiler alert, I am not one of those. When I find myself faced with the opportunity to add binding to a quilt, I'm gonna use my sewing machine to attach it and sew it down. I know that there's some of you out there that love hand binding and that's totally fine, but for me, it's machine all the way. It's so easy, even a sleep-deprived midnight quilter can do it. So starting with my beautifully trimmed panel, I'm actually gonna work from the back. And grabbing my adorable little binding tool, I'm gonna grab my binding and start sewing it along the edge. I wanna show you what I've done so far. First of all, I've cut it at an angle here, and then I pressed that down so I have a nice finished edge. So I'm gonna align this up with the edge of my quilt and start sewing it in place with that 1/4 inch seam. Your walking foot is gonna be your best friend for this. Now I have the binding open for right now, and I'm gonna sew it for about 4 or 5 inches or so. Basically, I'm leaving that edge open so I can tuck the other end into it. And once I've stitched it down a little bit, then I'm gonna fold it in place, align the raw edge of the binding up with the raw edge of the quilt, and start sewing it around all 4 sides. Of course, if you want it to be perfect, you could pin or clip the binding in place, but I'm just kind of positioning it as I go. Now, it's all fun and games until you get to the corner. There's something a little bit different we have to do in this area. So I'm gonna stop sewing about 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt, and I'm gonna backstitch a little bit just to help secure that. When I get to that corner, I need a little bit of extra binding to help wrap around. So what I'm gonna do is pull the binding back just like this, kind of creating that mitered corner. I'm basically imagining that this line of my binding is running the same as the edge of the quilt. Then holding that miter in place, I'm gonna fold it back on itself until it's flush with the edges like that. Now this one I will clip in place just to help keep it there. So just a quick little peek, so you can tell I have a little bit extra fabric in that corner, and that's gonna be exactly what I need when I do the next step. I am a little embarrassed to admit that it took me several quilts before I realized that. I would just kind of sew it to the edge and then go the next direction. And what happens with that is there's not enough fabric and it kind of pulls in weird on the corner. I mean, I just thought that's how it was done. I'm gonna stitch it in place, starting about 1/4 inch away from that corner. I mean, binding really isn't difficult. It's actually really easy. It's just by the time I get done with the quilting, I'm ready to start the next project. So this is really good for me to have a little bit of delayed gratification. And I'm just gonna keep on doing that, working my way around all 4 sides until I get close to my starting point. Now, one thing I should probably point out is you don't want to bind your quilts like this and enter it into a quilt show and hope to win a ribbon. That's not what we're doing here. We're trying to get some binding on this quilt nice and fast so we can hang it up and enjoy it. The exciting news is we're getting close to our starting point. So what I'm going to do is lay my tail of my binding over where I started and just trim it so that it kind of falls within that area right here. This is always good news. That means that there's plenty of binding left over because nobody wants to get to the end and realize you're like 3 inches short and you have to make more. That's just, that is nobody's idea of a good time. So I can see my opening right here. I want the binding to tuck in there nicely, so I'm just gonna rough cut it so that it fits in that area. And then I'm gonna pull that binding open right here and tuck it in, just like it's being nestled into its bed, nestled in for a good night's sleep, and fold the other edge over it. The reason I ironed it when we started was to give it that nice finished looking edge, even though it's not exactly finished. And for this, I'm definitely gonna clip it in place because I have a lot of stuff moving around and I don't want this last little bit to look extra wonky. Again, I know this might not be the most precise, perfect way to do it, but like I said, it's no fuss and nice and quick. And once I have it clipped in place, I'm gonna just go finish sewing that seam. Once I've made my way around all 4 sides, I have my binding halfway on. Now it's time to flip it to the other side and sew it down. Once I flip the quilt over, we're gonna see the seam where I sewed that binding onto the back. My goal here is to pull the binding around and over it so it covers it. This is where I'm gonna find out just how straight my seam was. My hope is that people will be looking at the quilting and so impressed by that they won't even bother to look at the binding. Now once I have the binding in place, I'm gonna take it to my sewing machine and sew it down by sewing a line just along that folded edge. And I could take a second and wrap it all around and clip it all in place, but I'm gonna kind of do it as I go. I'm not so much of a perfectionist, so I don't worry too much about that part. And then at the corner, remember where I added that extra fabric? That's gonna allow me to sew it down on one side and then fold it over and do the same on the other side. And that's gonna give me a lovely mitered looking corner when it's all sewn. And like I said, I'm sewing just a scant 1/8 inch really close to that folded edge, just because I don't want it to be super obvious. And as you can imagine, I'm sewing through lots of fabric here, so I'm gonna be sure to take my time and not go too fast. Now, an alternative option you have for this is instead of sewing that nice straight stitch along the fold, you can actually use a decorative stitch on your sewing machine to stitch it down. For instance, like a wavy line or maybe something with snowflakes. It's not only gonna hold that binding down, it's gonna give it a little bit of a decorative look as well. So the choice is definitely up to you. And there you can start to see my binding folded over, giving it that nice finished edge. It gives it that look that's like, oh yeah, that's handmade. I'm gonna keep doing that, working my way around all 4 sides of that wall hanging. People tend to have very strong feelings about their binding. They either love doing it or they hate it. And of course, by now we know which side I'm on. Then when I get to the corner, I'm gonna stop about 1/4 inch away from the edge and backstitch again just to help secure that stitching. Then I'm gonna cut my thread and rotate the quilt and work my way down the next side by folding that fabric over, covering up that seam and stitching it down in place. I like to think of this kind of like the victory lap of binding. I'm on my final lap, I'm almost done, and then I can move on to my next project. So I guess there is something I look forward to when I'm binding. And there's nothing quite as sweet as hitting that last couple of inches and knowing that you're oh so close to being finished with the binding. Well folks, I did it. I survived the great binding ordeal of 2025. I wonder if this is what it feels like to run a marathon. I know I'm being dramatic, but I'm glad that it's done. Look at that adorable binding. And to level up your wall hanging and use it as that ornament display, you can hand sew buttons in random places and use them to hang those beautiful ornaments. Just a fun way to make your room even more festive. And once you finish this, the placemats are gonna be a snap. All you have to do is sew binding around those, just like we did with this, and display them on your table. I just love how you can take that bigger panel and leave it as one beautiful wall hanging, or cut it up into smaller pieces and use it to decorate your house. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna do the only thing that's appropriate after finishing such an ordeal as this. I'm gonna grab a glass of wine and look at my almost perfect binding. Which project do you think you'd make? I hope you'll let me know by leaving a comment in the section below. And I'll be back soon with the next video in the series, where we're gonna learn how to quilt the Season's Greetings pillow panel using stencils and holiday themed designs. I can't wait. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.